In the late 1970s, across the rugged wilds of South America, a drifter roamed free, his hands stained with the blood of countless innocents. Pedro López claimed over 300 lives, girls lured to their doom with trinkets and lies. How could one man unleash such carnage and then vanish into the abyss? In the late 1960s, Colombia lay battered by la violencia, a brutal civil war that tore through the nation, leaving behind a wreckage of shattered homes and hollowed lives. Pedro López came into this world on October 8, 1948, in Santa Isabel, born to a mother stretched thin by poverty, the seventh of her 13 children. Raised amid chaos, he knew hunger and violence before he knew his own name, a boy cast adrift in a land where survival trumped hope. By his teens, he'd fled that broken cradle, crossing into Peru and Ecuador, countries buckling under their own burdens of neglect, where dusty markets buzzed with desperation and remote villages stood forgotten. There, López turned predator, his shadow falling over the helpless, his deeds masked by a society too fractured to care. Laws were brittle, enforcement a farce, and forensic science a clumsy afterthought in regions where justice was more myth than reality. His spree would later blaze across headlines, a nightmare that gripped South America, yet it faded from memory, not for lack of horror, but because it played out in corners the world ignored, lost to time, and a release in 1994 that defied reason, setting a killer free to melt into the unknown. Pedro López's descent into darkness didn't erupt overnight. It festered in the cracks of a life shaped by cruelty and neglect. Born on October 8, 1948, in Santa Isabel, Colombia, he entered a world already drowning in the blood of la violencia, a civil war that turned streets into slaughterhouses and families into ghosts. The seventh of 13 children, López grew up in a shack where hunger was a constant companion. His mother a seamstress stretched beyond breaking by poverty's weight. At 8, his childhood shattered. Caught molesting his younger sister, he was cast out by a furious mother, left to fend for himself in a land that devoured the weak. The streets became his cradle, but they offered no mercy. A year later, a stranger lured him into an abandoned ruin with promises of food, only to rape him and abandon him to the dust. That violation carved a scar deep into his soul, a wound that would later bleed into vengeance. By his teens, López had turned to petty theft, stealing cars, snatching wallets, honing a knack for survival in a world that cared little for his existence. In 1969, at 21, he was nabbed by Colombian police for auto theft and thrown into a prison cell, a dank pit where the law's grip was as feeble as its reach outside. There, the brutality of his past found a mirror. Gang-raped by 4 inmates, he endured a torment that snapped something inside him. Within weeks, he struck back, crafting a crude shank from a shard of metal. One by one, he stalked his assailants through the prison's dim corridors, slashing their throats in a spree of cold fury that left 3 dead and the 4th maimed. The guards shrugged. Self-defense, they called it. And by late 1969, López walked free, his hands freshly stained with blood, his mind sharpened by rage. He melted into South America's vast underbelly, a drifter crossing borders from Colombia to Peru, then Ecuador, leaving no trace but the echo of his steps. Years later, newspapers like Ecuador's El Comercio would recount his chilling confession. Soon after his release, he began hunting young girls, aged 9 to 12, targeting them in bustling markets with a predator's patience. He'd dangle trinkets, cheap bracelets, bits of candy, drawing them away with a smile that masked his intent. Court records from his 1983 trial in Ecuador pinpointed his first confirmed kills in the early 1970s. A string of shallow graves stretching across 3 nations, each one a silent testament to a terror just beginning to unfold. Pedro López's reign of terror carved its mark through South America with a method as deceptively simple as it was grotesque. He roamed the frayed edges of a continent in turmoil, Colombia's war-ravaged hamlets still reeling from la violencia, Peru's remote Ayacucho highlands, where dust clung to every breath, and Ecuador's crowded Ambato markets, buzzing with life unaware of the predator in its midst. His targets were always the same: girls aged 9 to 12, their youth and trust, what he later chillingly dubbed a look of innocence, drawing him like a moth to a flame. López hunted with a predator's patience, blending into the chaos of open-air stalls and dirt paths. His bait was minimal but effective. A cheap trinket dangled before their eyes, a bracelet of twisted wire or a piece of stale candy, paired with a soft-spoken lie about a gift or a shortcut home. The girls followed, their small hands clutching his offerings, oblivious to the fate awaiting them beyond the market's din. He'd lead them to secluded spots, patches of scrubland, riverbanks, or forested slopes, often to shallow pits he'd clawed into the earth beforehand, graves lying in wait like silent traps. There, his facade crumbled. He raped them, his fingers then curling around their fragile necks, strangling them with a brute force that silenced their cries and snuffed out their lives. Historical records, drawn from his 1980 confessions to Ecuadorian police, unveil a detail that freezes the blood. López didn't always abandon his victims to the soil. Sometimes he'd revisit the burial sites days or weeks later, digging up the bodies for what he called tea parties, a grotesque mockery where he'd prop the corpses upright, their decaying forms posed as if in conversation, his voice filling the silence with a one-sided dialogue that twisted death into a sickening charade. By 1979, a crack appeared in his shroud of secrecy. A flash flood tore through the Ambato countryside, its waters churning the earth and spitting out 4 small skeletons. Girls, their bones bearing the telltale fractures of strangulation, their remains ravaged by scavengers that had stripped flesh from truth. Local papers, like fragments of Ecuador's El Comercio, erupted with brief, frantic reports, but in a region dulled by poverty and violence, the finds were mourned as stray losses, not linked to a single hand. That illusion held until March 1980. López prowled Ambato's market again, his trinket outstretched toward another girl, but this time her mother, Carvina Poveda, stood watch. Her piercing scream shattered the morning air, rallying vendors and passers-by who swarmed him, pinning him to the ground in a fury that nearly ended in a lynching. Police stormed in just as the crowd's rage peaked, pulling López from their grasp. His reign had faltered, and the first threads of his monstrous tapestry began to unravel under the weight of a mother's desperate cry. The trap closed on Pedro López on March 9, 1980, sparked by Carvina Poveda's fierce defiance in Ambato's bustling market. Her piercing cry had unleashed a storm, Vendors and bystanders surged forward, tackling López to the ground, their hands clawing at him in a rage that threatened to tear him apart. Police pushed through the roiling crowd just in time, yanking him from the brink of a mob's justice and hauling him to the station in chains. There, López sat in a stark cell, his face a mask of indifference, his silence a wall against the officers' relentless questions. Hours bled into days with no breakthrough, his refusal to speak pushing the case toward a standstill. Then, Major Victor Lascaño, Ambato's prison director, hatched a cunning ploy. He enlisted Pastor Cordova Gudino, a local priest with a steady gaze, to don ragged clothes and slip into López's cell as a faux inmate. For 10 days, Gudino wove a web of trust, sharing murmurs in the flickering shadows until López's guard faltered. The confession that followed was a torrent. 110 murders in Ecuador, he claimed, with a chilling boast of over 300 spanning Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, each word a dagger to the priest's ears. Shackled and led into the Andes foothills near Ambato, López guided police to 53 shallow graves, crudely dug hollows where skeletal remains of girls lay scattered, some with necks twisted and broken, others gnawed to fragments by scavengers. Forensic work, stunted by basic tools and nature's decay, still traced strangulation marks on the brittle bones, corroborating López's tale of killing with his bare hands. Lascaño, his voice heavy, told El Comercio reporters, "He claims 300, but I dread it's more, far more than we'll ever unearth." Searches stretched to Colombia and Peru, but those nations yielded only whispers, missing girls lost to time, no graves to mark their end. In 1983, Ecuador's courts convened for López's trial, a stark affair bathed in grim light. Prosecutors laid out the evidence: 53 bodies, Gudino's testimony, López's own cold recounting, a catalogue of slaughter too vast to deny. Yet Ecuador's lenient laws capped his sentence at 16 years, delivered with a smirk from the dock. He served 14, released in August 1994 for good behavior, then deported to Colombia. A brief stay in a psychiatric ward ended in 1998 with a $50 bail payment, and López vanished into the void, his trail dissolving into nothing. Pedro López's saga didn't vanish when he walked free in 1994. It festered, a wound left open. In 2002, a grim discovery shook Colombia. A young girl, strangled and tossed into a ditch, her death a haunting mirror of López's brutal handiwork. Authorities froze. Had the killer resurfaced after slipping away in 1998? Whispers from his prison days added fuel to the dread. Fellow inmates swore he'd spoken of others, dark figures who'd hovered near his kills, soaking in his methods, perhaps eager to inherit his legacy of slaughter. Had López schooled a protégé in the art of strangling innocence, a disciple now stalking in his stead? Or does he himself still prowl the Andes' tangled wilds, his hands restless for more blood? He'd bragged of over 300 victims, yet only 53 were unearthed. Hundreds could lie scattered in unmarked graves, their bones a silent cry against a justice system too flimsy to bind him. Since his last sighting, the trail has gone cold, leaving a void where answers should be, a gaping question mark over a terror unbound. Pedro López etched a nightmare across South America, a reaper claiming over 300 souls, his hands choking the life from girls lured by trinkets, 53 dragged from Ambato's cursed earth. A priest's guile and fractured bones unmasked him, yet Ecuador's frail justice spat him out after 14 years, a monster unbound since 1998. History clutches his confession, a ledger of slaughter, but the man has dissolved into shadow. Why does this abyss of terror drift into oblivion, drowned by flashier horrors? Does he still stalk the Andes' gloom, or did he birth a successor to wield his grim harvest? Subscribe to Forgotten Crimes, hit the bell, and share your theories below. Has Lopez's bloodlust truly vanished, or does it pulse in unseen hands?